they all have a high view of Jesus Christ after they've redefined him, after they've made him to be something less than God incarnate. They then give to him high accolades. So we've been doing this for 2,000 years, folks. I want to begin by taking about 10 minutes and just giving us an overview of the section that is to come. Because here at chapter 8, this is a pivotal passage. This is one of the most pivotal passages in all of Mark's gospel. This is a passage on which the entire story of the gospel will turn. Everything will change at this point. Now, we've said all along that a good stopping point in Mark's gospel would be the end of chapter 8, which is where we are now. And so as we begin this, we're starting a new section that will take us now through the end of chapter 10. And so what I want to do is spend about 10 minutes just to give an overview, a lay of the next section so that I always find it helpful to know what's coming. I always find it helpful to know ahead of time where the writer's taking me so that I can be looking for that. So I just want to take a few minutes to do that right now, just so that we see what Mark is doing. So this is the pivot point in Mark's gospel. Chapter 8, verse 29, the declaration, "You are the Christ." It is the absolute epitome. It is the high point, the high water mark of Mark's gospel. It is literally like the spiritual fulcrum. You know, the fulcrum where you got this point and you got the seesaw thing. Who remembers back from who's old enough that back in elementary school, you had the real cool toys on the playground and you had the seesaw. And so if you had the seesaw as a kid, every one of you, I can promise you this, you were at some point sitting on the seesaw up on the high side and the other person hopped off and you sort of did the vertebrae shattering crash down. That's what it's like right now. This fulcrum, this point at which all of the gospel hinges right now, we're going to notice a marked and a noticeable change in direction here in verse 30 of chapter 8. So the entire first half of Mark's gospel has been spent answering the question, who is this man? And so this is why the first half of Mark's gospel has been so consumed with showing us the power of Jesus, the might of Jesus, the miracle working ability of Jesus. Because Mark has been consumed with this question, who is this man? From this point on, the question will now shift, not from who is this man, now it's going to go to why is he here? What is he here to do? Why has God sent him? Who is this man had to be answered in order for us to know why he's here. His work can only be work that comes out of who he is. So we had to first know who he is. Now knowing who he is, you are the Christ, everything will now shift to why is he here? What is he here to do? So Mark's theme, the theme of all the Gospel of Mark, as we've said before, is this. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's what he said in the very first sentence of the Gospel, and everything he said thereafter is tracing that theme. Jesus Christ is the Son of God enfleshed. The good news, the gospel, that Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God and he has come to us. So in Mark's gospel, there are 6 great confessions, 6 declarations that Jesus Christ is the Christ, the anointed one, the Son of God. We saw the first one, of course, in chapter 1, verse 1, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The second declaration is the one, really, I guess you could not call it a declaration, but it comes in chapter 4 on the water at the end of the storm. It comes in the form of the question, who is this man? So that's not really a declaration. So in your notes, it's got an asterisk beside it. But the answer is implied, isn't it? The answer is implied. This man just spoke to a storm and it obeyed him. So clearly this man is more than just a man. So that's the second one. The third one, and in some ways the pinnacle, is the one before us. You are the Christ. The next one will come at the end of chapter 10, when blind Bartimaeus, or better, I guess more accurately, formerly blind Bartimaeus, will say, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now that might not sound to us like that great of a confession, because that language doesn't ring in our ears like it would ring in the ears of a first century Jew. But the title Son of David carries just as much messianic freight as does the title of Christ. Christ means the anointed one, Christos. And in Jesus' day, Christos could be used in many ways. It could be used in a spiritual way or in other ways to say this is the anointed one, the chosen one. Peter is, of course, using this in a spiritual way. But nevertheless, the term Christos, of course, carries spiritual freight, but Son of David also carries an equivalent amount of spiritual freight in another way. So when he says, Son of David, have mercy on me, when we get to that passage, we'll see that that is a highly messianic title as well. In addition to that, he asks him to have mercy on him in the form of his blindness. So to ask Jesus to have mercy on me by taking away my blindness, clearly, that's a declaration of who Jesus is. Then the next declaration will come in chapter 14. This one will come at the lips of Jesus as he sends on the night of his arrest, as he's before the high priest, and the high priest will mockingly say, so you are the Christ? And Jesus will say, I am. And then the final, in another sense, the ultimate, the last declaration comes in chapter 15 and verse 39. This one's at the lips of the centurion, the Roman centurion, which we're reminded once again that Mark is writing to Roman Christians. The Roman centurion will himself say, truly, this man was the Son of God. So the declaration that's before us, you are the Christ, begins, well really, this section really began in the previous passage, but this declaration is bookended by the next declaration at the end of chapter 10, the declaration of blind Bartimaeus. And so this section, Mark likes to bookend things. We've talked about that. So this section is bookended by these two declarations, and it's bookended, more importantly, by the healing of two blind men. The unnamed blind man of chapter 8, in that the most unusual of healings, in which it takes place in two steps, and then Jesus asks the man, can you see clearly? That is one bookend, and the other bookend is blind Bartimaeus, who will declare, Son of David, have mercy on me. So between these two sections, this now comprises the next section to which we will look. Now this section, we're going to notice a change in just not only theme and the points that Mark is making, but we're also going to notice a change in context. We're going to notice a change in setting. Because the first half of Mark's gospel, I'm sure you probably noticed, but the first half of Mark's gospel really took place beside and on top of and in a whole lot of water. Did you notice that? There was all these boat journeys. Really, the majority of the first half of the gospel takes place either on the water, beside the water, just getting out of the boat, or in the water at Jesus' baptism. The majority of the first half is somewhere to do with water. And in fact, 3 of the greatest instances in the first half take place on the boat. That's where the disciples' non-understanding and misunderstanding is displayed and demonstrated. Now, at this section, we're going to notice that there is no more water. There are no more boats. The last boat journey has taken place in Mark's gospel, and the boat journeys are now replaced with road journeys. So what we're going to see now is on the way. And this is unmistakable. You can't miss this because Mark again and again will say, on the way this happens, on the way that happens. So we see here, on the way, Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say I am? In the next chapter, on the way, Jesus is going to ask his disciples what they're arguing about. The next chapter, chapter 10, on the way, Jesus is asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Then later on the way, Jesus will give the final of 3 teachings about his coming suffering. And that final teaching, that third of 3 teachings of his coming suffering, he's going to give it on the way. And at that point, the reader will be told for the first time where they are on their way to, which is Jerusalem. Now, we know where Jesus is going. We know that because we've read the Gospel of Mark and we've read the Gospels. And so we know that this is the journey to Jerusalem to die. But in Mark's Gospel, he's not told the reader that yet. The reader, if you're following along in Mark's Gospel, you've not yet been told where Jesus is going. You won't be told that until the end of chapter 10 on the final teaching, the Son of Man must suffer and be killed and be raised. And at that point, we will be told that he's on his way to Jerusalem, on the way to Jerusalem to die. Right after that, we're going to encounter Bartimaeus, who is on the way, or literally beside the way. Jesus will restore his sight, and after having his sight restored, he will then join Jesus once again on the way to Jerusalem. And then the very first verse of chapter 11 will be, Jesus came to Jerusalem for the triumphal entry. You see, so this entire section is on the way to Jerusalem. So we'll begin to talk about that this morning. But then just to sort of notice a couple of themes that Mark is going to bring out. The first half of the gospel really was, again, consumed with the theme of who Jesus is and the power and the might of Jesus. The one who speaks a word and the seas are calm. He speaks a word and legion flees from him. He touches a leper and the leper is restored and cleansed. But now the themes are going to shift, and they're going to shift in such a way that the incompetence, the spiritual incompetence of the disciples is now going to become more prominent and more important. Now you say, well, the spiritual incompetence of the disciples has been on display since chapter 1, and you'd be right. However, their spiritual dullness is really going to become even more apparent and even more obvious and even more meaningful. Because their spiritual non-comprehension in the first 8 chapters really had to do with the fact that they couldn't understand Jesus' parables. They didn't understand the loaves. They didn't understand the meanings of the feedings and all these things. All those things were tremendously important. But now their spiritual non-understanding is going to center upon one issue, and that is the Messiah's need to suffer and die. Repeatedly, they are going to not understand why Jesus is saying that he must suffer and die. So 3 times they are going to demonstrate on the way to Jerusalem, they're going to demonstrate that they don't understand that. And then all 3 times Jesus will follow that by a teaching of, first of all, his suffering that is to come. And then in addition to that, the fact that if they're going to follow him, their path of following him will also be a path of suffering just like his. In your notes here, chapter 8, this is the passage right before us. Peter will rebuke Jesus when he speaks of suffering. That will be followed immediately by, we know the passage, take up your cross and follow me. The next one will come in chapter 9. On the way, the disciples will be bickering about which of them is the greatest. Jesus will answer that bickering by saying whoever will be first must be last. And then finally in chapter 10, James and John are going to be grasping at the seat of power, who's going to sit on the right and who's going to sit on the left. Jesus will hear that. The disciples, by the way, are angry about that, but they're not angry because they're thinking James and John are out of line. They're angry because they also want the seats of power themselves. Jesus will hear all of that, and he will answer by saying, whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And then he'll follow that up with, for not even the Son of Man came to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So that's what's ahead of us in the next 3 chapters between here towards the end of chapter 8 and to the end of chapter 10. I always find that helpful to see what's coming up. You can take that and use that in your own personal study time, or you can kind of have that by you as we work through these next 3 chapters. Or if you don't find it helpful, you can kick it aside. Either way, it's just helpful, I think, to sort of know what's coming. So now, knowing what's coming, let's dive into this section. Beginning from verse 27, we read, "And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?' And they told him, 'John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets.' And he asked them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Peter answered him, 'You are the Christ.' And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him." So as we begin in this pivotal section, we begin on this journey. We're told now they're near the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. We don't want to take too much time talking about Caesarea Philippi, other than just to know that Caesarea Philippi is a different Philippi from the Philippi of Philippians. But Caesarea Philippi was a city located some 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. that's going to put Jesus at the furthest point from Jerusalem that's ever recorded. 25 or so miles north of the Sea of Galilee is going to put Jesus in a place that is as far from Jerusalem as he can possibly be and still be within the land of Israel. He's going to be physically, geographically, as far from Jerusalem as he's ever recorded to be, which is meaningful because this distance is the distance that we're told he begins the journey to Jerusalem. Now, Caesarea Philippi was a city that was known, it was renowned in the ancient world as a city that was, well, should we say, very enthusiastic of its worship of the pagan god by the name of Pan. You might remember as we studied Ephesians, we talked about how Ephesus was a city that was renowned for its worship of Diana or Artemis. The city of Caesarea Philippi was somewhat equivalent to that in its worship of the pagan god Pan. So this place that was renowned for pagan worship is going to be the place in which Jesus sovereignly arranges that the greatest declaration of his identity to date is going to take place, which reminds me of an equivalent story, or a parallel story, I should say, from the Old Testament. If you remember back from Elijah, the story of Elijah, the whole Mount Carmel incident, where Mount Carmel is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstration of who God is, of the person of God, the identity and the power of God. And we saw in that passage that this place takes place in Mount Carmel, which was a place that was renowned in the ancient world for pagan worship. So God chooses a place that's known for its pagan worship in which to demonstrate his identity and his sovereignty and his power. The same thing, or a similar thing at least, happens here in Caesarea Philippi. So Jesus went on with his disciples. He went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" So that's a logical question, right? Any leader of any movement is going to have some level of concern over what the popular opinion of him is. Who are people saying that I am? So it's natural for us to think that Jesus would ask that question, until we, of course, are reminded of a couple of things. First of all, Jesus didn't have to ask anybody what people thought of him. Jesus is the one that, remember, we're told in chapter 2, he perceived in his spirit what they were thinking. He perceived in his spirit that they were saying in their own hearts, who can forgive sins but God alone? Furthermore, we're reminded in John's gospel, John says that nobody had to tell Jesus the hearts of men. He knew the hearts of men. So Jesus doesn't need information here. He's not asking for information because he's interested in knowing what people think about him. Furthermore, and even more consequently, Jesus was one who put no stock, he placed no value in what people who didn't believe in him thought of him. We know that because even Jesus' enemies said so. They will say to Jesus in Mark chapter 12, "Teacher, we know that you're not someone who places stock in people's opinions of you." Now, if your enemy gives you a compliment, then that's something that's pretty trustworthy. And so one of the things that Jesus' enemies said about him was, "Teacher, we know that you don't really care about the opinions of people. You only care about the opinion of God." So Jesus, resoundingly, we can say this with authority, Jesus is not concerned about popular opinion of him. He's asking the question for the same reason that he has done these other recent oddities, the oddity of the healing of the deaf man, the blind man, the Syrophoenician woman. Jesus is establishing a type of object lesson for the benefit of his disciples. He's doing the same thing here. He asked this question for the benefit of his disciples because he's setting them up for the next question, of course. So this is something else that's going to change here, beginning in towards the end of chapter 8 here, is Jesus will now begin asking probing questions. Jesus has not been one to ask questions, or at least not recorded for us yet, but he's going to begin to be one who is probing his disciples with these intuitive questions. Who do people say that I am? Now, verse 28. They told him John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. So here's this threefold list of who the popular opinion of who Jesus is of the day. Two of the three kind of makes sense to us. The third really is hard to understand. John the Baptist, I'm not really sure where that one came from. We remember that Herod thought that perhaps Jesus was John the Baptist. But this is really hard to understand because nowhere does Scripture connect the two in the same person like this. Furthermore, Jesus has been seen with John the Baptist. Remember chapter 1. He's been seen in public with John the Baptist. It's kind of hard to be mistaken for someone when you've been seen together with that person. So that one's a little bit hard to understand, but nevertheless, it's there. A lot of people seem to be saying, this man is, maybe he's John the Baptizer, maybe he's John the Baptist. But then the other two, of course, Elijah, some say that you're Elijah. We remember that Old Testament prophecy that says, before the great and terrible day of the Lord, Elijah will come. That comes to you in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, which are the last two verses of your Old Testament. So now you can impress all your friends when you're having conversation with your friends and they ask you, where does the Old Testament say that Elijah must come first? Oh, that's the last two verses of the Old Testament. They're easy to find too. So you can impress your friends that way. But Malachi chapter 4, 5, and 6 tell us that Elijah must come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So some people are reading that and they're saying, well, maybe this man Jesus is that man Elijah come back. Now, we're not going to explore into that further because in John's gospel, he delves into that subject and he says, indeed, Elijah has come, but you didn't see him. And so the teaching that comes out of that is a spiritual resurgence of Elijah there. But we won't have time to delve into that. But there's the Elijah thing that's out there. But then there's also one of the prophets. Some are saying that you're one of the prophets. Now, Matthew is going to tell us in Matthew 16 that the prophet that the people have in mind is the prophet Jeremiah. Maybe you're Jeremiah that's come. This reminds us of Deuteronomy 18 and verse 18, where we're told, other places too, where we're told that God will say, I will raise up another prophet and he will speak my words. I will put my words into his mouth and he will speak my words and the people will listen. So those are three opinions of who this man Jesus might be. So a couple of things for us to notice in those three popular opinions of Jesus. Number one is this. Even Jesus' enemies can't explain what he's doing outside of supernatural explanations. So Jesus' teaching, his miracles, the things that Jesus is doing, no one can explain this without using some sort of spiritual, supernatural explanation to explain what this man is doing. Just as even Jesus' enemies will say to him, we know that you are sent from God because no one who's not sent from God can do the things that you're doing. Nicodemus will say that to Jesus in John chapter 3. We know you have to be from God for the things that you're doing. So they are resorting to some type of supernatural explanation. But then the other thing to really see, and this is, I think, where this is helpful for us today, is to see as they are describing who they think this man Jesus is, these three choices, these three options, are any of them insulting to Jesus or demeaning to Jesus? Are any of them pejorative in any way? No, these are quite lofty opinions of who Jesus might be. For anyone other than Jesus Christ to be compared to John the Baptizer, what a thing to say about somebody. To say, well, perhaps this man is Elijah. Again, for anyone other than the Son of God, what a complimentary thing. So this says to us something about the popular opinion of Jesus' day, which was mostly what? Quite positive. We know the Pharisees hated him. We know they're trying to kill him. But the majority, Jesus isn't asking about the Pharisees' opinion. He's asking about the people's opinion. The majority of people's opinion is largely positive, but get this, it's positive based on a redefinition of who Jesus is. You see what they did? They redefined who Jesus is. They lowered Jesus down to the level of prophet, and having redefined him, reimagined him, they now give to him accolades. That's exactly what we've been doing for 2,000 years, isn't it? Do you know that the popular opinion of Jesus, if you were to say, what's most people's opinion of Jesus? Do most people have a high opinion of Jesus or a low opinion of Jesus? Well, the answer to that question matters. And the answer to that question depends on what understanding you have of Jesus. The popular opinion of the Jesus that Scripture presents to us, which is the Jesus who says to us, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. The popular opinion of that Jesus has always been very low and always will be very low until the day that every knee bows to him. But what most people do in our day, just like in Jesus' day, is they redefine him to be something less than what he is, still high and lofty, and having done that, they now have a high opinion of him. Do you know that every religion in the world has a high view of Jesus? Every religion. Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, the false religions of Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Roman Catholics. They all have a high view of Jesus Christ after they've redefined him. After they've made him to be something less than God incarnate. They then give to him high accolades. So we've been doing this for 2,000 years, folks. We've been taking the reality of Jesus Christ presented to us in the Scriptures, bringing it down to a level that we can manage, or to use a phrase that most of us will remember, taking him by force and making him king. Remember that? Taking him by force and making him king. We now have a Jesus that everyone can celebrate.